Part 1. What he made. The most dangerous person in any room is never the loudest one. It's the one sitting quietly in the corner, watching, filing everything away behind calm eyes, waiting for the precise moment when patience becomes something else entirely. Remember that. It matters here. Her brother Daniel was the kind of person who made the world feel gentler just by existing in it. 16 years old, soft-spoken, a painter, the kind of boy who laughed with his whole face and meant it every time. He was also gay, and in the particular town where they grew up, that single fact was enough for someone to decide his existence needed to be punished. Ryan was 17, broad-shouldered, socially comfortable, the specific kind of confident that isn't really confidence. It's the feeling of having someone smaller to stand on. He had confused those two things his entire life. No one had ever corrected him. What he did to Daniel wasn't casual cruelty. It was sustained, inventive. The slurs came first, lobbed across hallways, landing like small explosions that echoed long after the crowd dispersed. Then the physical, shoves in stairwells, food knocked from trays, Daniel's sketchbook torn apart in the school courtyard, while a ring of classmates chose, mostly, to watch. The school held meetings, used phrases like zero tolerance. Ryan's father was on the school board. That fact settled over every meeting like ink dropped in water, invisible but coloring everything. She was home one weekend, 2 years older than Daniel, in her first year at university. She noticed the sketchbooks were gone from his desk. His room felt like a held breath. She asked how he was. He said, "Fine," in the specific tone that means the opposite. 3 months later, the call. Daniel had been admitted to a psychiatric facility. Acute anxiety, dissociative episodes, clinical language wrapping around something that was, at its core, much simpler. A gentle person had been systematically broken by someone who had never been stopped. She drove home through the night, 4 hours, radio off, hands steady. She wasn't crying. She had moved past that somewhere around the second hour, into something colder, quieter, the place where grief compresses itself into pure intention. Part 2. The education. She went back to university and changed course. Not transferred, that was too slow. She began auditing every psychology class available, sitting front row, reading everything the syllabus didn't require. Her professors noticed. She wasn't interested in healing. She was interested in architecture, the specific architecture of the human mind under sustained, sourceless stress. What makes people crack? What makes them doubt themselves? How perception bends without the subject ever feeling the bend begin. She read about paranoia not as a condition to treat, but as a system to understand. She studied case studies of people whose grip on reality had been loosened, not by trauma, but by the relentless accumulation of small, inexplicable events, things that meant nothing individually and everything collectively. She took notes, color-coded, filed by category. Alongside this, she began learning Ryan. She identified people at the periphery of his life, acquaintances, not friends, and listened carefully. She learned his schedule, his routines, his vanities, and, most importantly, his particular architecture of fear, because everyone has one. Ryan had built his entire identity on being perceived as stable, normal, in control. His confidence wasn't a foundation, it was a performance. And performances have a specific vulnerability. They collapse the moment the audience starts to doubt. She noted this, filed it carefully. Then she waited a full 14 months, not because she needed more time to plan, but because she needed Ryan completely comfortable. Guard down, sense of invulnerability fully restored. She needed him to have no context whatsoever for what was about to begin. Part 3. First movement. The first incident was almost nothing. His car, a dark blue sedan he was visibly proud of, began appearing parked at a slightly different angle than he remembered leaving it. Not moved dramatically, just a few degrees off. The kind of thing you can't mention to anyone because it sounds insane. The kind that makes you stand in a parking lot for 30 seconds, frowning, wondering if you're simply tired. He was tired. He went home. 2 weeks later, voicemails. Not threatening, not even coherent, just breathing occasionally and ambient sound. Called from prepaid phones purchased with cash, placed at 2 a.m., never repeated from the same number. Once. Silence for a week, then once more from somewhere new. Not enough to report, not enough to name, exactly enough to plant something. She understood a principle that most people never articulate. Fear doesn't require a monster, it requires uncertainty. The mind, denied an explanation, constructs its own. And the mind's constructions are almost always worse than any truth. She wasn't trying to scare him, she was teaching him to scare himself. Small things began to move in his life. A jacket thrown across his back seat would be found folded neatly on the passenger side. A photograph shifted an inch on his desk. Nothing missing, nothing damaged, just adjusted. Just enough to make a person stand in a room and feel, without being able to say why, that they were not entirely alone in their own life. Part 4. Summer. Heat. The shrimp. She had learned, through careful peripheral listening, that Ryan had a significant date coming up. Someone new. Someone whose opinion of him mattered in the specific, heightened way early courtship makes everything matter. He had borrowed a friend's nicer car and had it professionally detailed the day before. On a warm Thursday evening, she moved quietly through a parking lot. 4 sealed Ziploc bags, raw shrimp, placed with care inside the hubcaps of the car. Invisible, undetectable. It was July. By the time of the date, the car smelled like something had died inside the walls. He couldn't explain it. The detail service was recalled. The car was searched twice, cleaned thoroughly, searched again. The smell remained, because the bags weren't found for another 3 days, by which point the date had ended early and awkwardly, and Ryan had spent a full weekend convinced that something was invisibly, fundamentally wrong with him. His hygiene, his luck, some nameless thing that kept going wrong. The mechanic who eventually found the bags called it a prank. Ryan had no idea by whom. He had no enemies he could name, or so he believed. That uncertainty was, of course, exactly the point. She recorded nothing, told no one, and moved on. Over the following months, the campaign continued, each action engineered according to the same principle: inexplicable, unverifiable, plausible enough to be real and strange enough to be impossible to dismiss. His mail, occasionally reorganized in the box, not taken, reorganized, as though handled. Security alerts appearing on his accounts from unusual locations. She never accessed them. She had simply learned how these systems could be triggered from the outside, legitimately, without leaving a trace. At social events, casual acquaintances who didn't know her would relay, without realizing they were being guided, vague, unsettling fragments. Someone had apparently been asking about him. Someone at a party had said something strange when his name came up. Nothing specific enough to pursue. Everything specific enough to fester. She identified the fault lines in his social world, the friendships built on performance rather than genuine affection, and applied pressure there. Not dramatically, consistently. The cultivation of a quiet, atmospheric feeling among people who knew him that something was off about Ryan lately. He seemed different, people said. Distracted. He'd lost his ease. He had. He didn't know why. That absence of explanation was more corrosive than any confrontation could have been. Part 5. The Collapse. By the end of the second year, Ryan had lost 2 close friends. Not in confrontations, but in the slow way exhausting people lose relationships, through quiet withdrawal and unanswered messages. His work had become inconsistent. He slept badly. He was 20 years old and had been prescribed anxiety medication and was afraid, on some nights, of his own home. The moment his remaining friends later marked as the breaking point was, in isolation, unremarkable. At a party, he became convinced people were speaking about him in coordinated, meaningful ways. He left abruptly and sent a series of increasingly incoherent messages to 2 friends, accusing them of things they didn't understand. Those friendships did not recover. His world contracted, then contracted further. A therapist gave him words: hypervigilance, anxiety disorder, and he accepted them with the exhausted relief of someone finally handed a name for a pain they couldn't locate. The diagnosis wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete. The cause wasn't inside him, It had been placed there, carefully, from the outside. She watched from a distance, as she always had, and felt something she hadn't anticipated. Not triumph, something more like the end of a long proof, the answer emerging from the work, clean and exact. But also something heavier, the recognition that precision and justification are two entirely different things, and that she had always possessed the first and only constructed the second. She sat with that quietly. Part 6. What she learned, what he sent. Daniel came home after 8 months. Not resolved, these things never are. He began the long, unglamorous work of rebuilding. Therapy, medication, the slow return of ordinary things. He painted again. Not immediately, but eventually, the sketchbooks reappeared on his desk. The smell of paint on Sunday afternoons came back to the house. She had been waiting for that specific sign, without admitting to herself that she was waiting for it. She never told him what she had done. She had considered it. There were moments when telling him felt like a gift she could give. Look what I built for you. Look how I made it right. But she understood, finally, that this impulse was about her. Daniel didn't need her revenge. He needed his own recovery. These were not the same thing, and she had come close to confusing them. So she kept it. Then, 2.5 years after she had begun, something arrived that she had not planned for. A letter. Handwritten. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting from documents she had studied years before. It was from Ryan. He had found her. She never learned exactly how. The letter was 3 pages, and it was not what she expected. There were no accusations. He didn't know what she had done. He didn't even mention Daniel directly until the 2nd page. What the letter said, haltingly, across 3 handwritten pages, was this: that he had spent the last 2 years in therapy, that his therapist had guided him back through his life looking for the roots of what he had become, and that somewhere in the excavation he had arrived at the memory of what he had done to a boy named Daniel in high school. That he had arrived at it not as an excuse or a footnote, but as a source. As the thing that, when he looked at it honestly, he was most ashamed of in his life. That he had tried to find Daniel's contact information and had found hers instead. He was writing to say he was sorry. Not to her. He was asking if she would pass it along. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time with the letter in her hands. This was not the ending she had built. She had constructed an ending of isolation and permanent damage, a wound with no weapon, a cause he would never find. She had been precise and patient and deliberate. And then he had found the cause himself, without her. She thought about what to do with the letter for several days. She thought about all of it, what she had done, why, what it had cost her, what it had cost him, what any of it had actually resolved, and what it had only rearranged. She gave Daniel the letter. She watched his face while he read it. She didn't try to interpret what she saw there. It was too complex and too private, and it belonged entirely to him. He folded it carefully when he finished, set it on the table, looked out the window for a while. Then he said, "I don't know what to do with this yet." She said, "You don't have to do anything with it." He nodded. They sat there together in the kitchen, and neither of them said anything for a while. And outside the window, the light was doing something complicated with the clouds, and Daniel eventually got up and went to his room, and a little while later, she could smell the paint. She sat alone with the letter on the table, and with 2.5 years of careful, deliberate work, and with the strange, specific feeling of someone who has won something and is not entirely certain what. She had set out to make Ryan feel what Daniel felt, the sourceless dread, the fractured reality, the long months of not knowing why. She had succeeded, precisely. And then, from somewhere inside the damage, he had done the one thing she hadn't accounted for. He had looked at himself honestly. She didn't know what to do with that either. She left the letter on the table and went to stand in the doorway of Daniel's room, where he was painting, unhurried, in the late afternoon light. She watched him for a moment, said nothing, went back to her own life, carrying all of it.